So I'm going back to an old notebook. So things are kind of out of order, but that's not what matters. The process is just about giving voice to insights and things that I see, not necessarily putting them in logical order, because putting them in logical order doesn't leave much room for the new creative expression that might come through in sharing that bit. But for starters, last night I reduced the trazodone by 1/2. So I took 1.5 trazodone and I took a Seroquel. I want to start taking a half Seroquel, but I don't have a pill cutter, so I might have to get one of those or really just try to cut it in half. And I'm still taking the Hearty Nutritionals daily. So where I left off in my old notebook was talking about the body is a perceptual apparatus, and it's also a holographic net. So it's sort of clinging on to the images it's recording and associating those images with the past. So I wonder if we can be free from the holographic net and not record with it, not try to find new images to associate with old images. And I actually think that this is partially what builds up for people who have a tendency towards map consciousness. And when this recording isn't going on in map consciousness, the mind sort of touches reality instead of reality being touched by the images, and thus not really meeting reality at all. So the mind moves when the images don't move, and then the mind moves through us and animates us. And none of this is really true. It's just playing with ideas and thoughts and insights. I feel like the old holograms resonate with the new incoming information and only pick out bits that are similar to it. So it blocks the new information and only looks for similar information. And maybe the brain sees this as some type of efficiency because it's calculating whether or not what it's meeting will serve its purposes. But its purposes have been programmed. So we're meeting life with the purposes of our programs. And so not really meeting it at all. The net of thought is holographic. And the me is this interference pattern that's interfering with all the new information coming towards us. It interferes with life, with actual life. And it seems like human beings are caught in this prison and this net of holographic light and sound. And I feel when this process stops, the matter of the brain then speaks life, life as it's met. And our choosing mechanism, our decision mechanism is part of this net. We're choosing with our net and grabbing those bits of reality. And when we think, we send out holograms. And can we stop adding to this collective recording that we all share? And I made up a word, holographonic. So it's sort of this light and sound, and it's part of the image making process through which we meet life. And it seems like the universe has created a creature that can harmonize with life, with its gestures and words, or destroy it. We're the only creature that can really choose to be in disharmony in a way. It's like we can pick an avocado and eat it, or we can just cut down the tree. And in terms of, first there was the word. It seems like that's choice, and we can choose to use the word for destruction or harmonizing. And I had this thought that there are lots of other planets that supported life at some point. And the life eventually developed words and language. And then there was the choice to harmonize with the language or to use it for destruction. And if life chose to use it for destruction, it eventually would destroy the very life that created the language. The language evolved from life, from living things. And then the language, when used to destroy, eventually destroys life itself. So I had this thought that maybe there are a lot of planets that had life, but they destroyed it. And so it's no longer there. And I remember Alan Watts, he has a video on YouTube describing how he imagined that life could evolve to destroy itself, and then it would. And I can't remember if he said it in his video or if I thought of this, but I don't know. I can't remember if I did. But if we blew ourselves up, for example, DNA would go reeling through the universe, and it would kind of seed a planet somewhere with life. Eventually, life would be created somewhere else on the suitable planet that the DNA got to. And it might get to many planets, but only one might actually evolve life. So humanity, evolving as it does with language, eventually uses the language and the intellect to blow itself up. But then that seeds other planets with DNA and life. And maybe that's how life spreads throughout the universe, sort of like one planet, then the next planet, then the next. So there's always another planet. And in terms of questioning the prior assumption, we never question that which makes assumption happen, which is thought, which is language, which is our accumulated information. We accumulate information and then we can't see life. And life will tell us different information. And I think this whole thought part is key in terms of being able to transform somewhat, because when the energy, the increased energy comes in, it amps up whatever's there. So if there's too many thoughts, it's going to have to deal with thoughts from the outside. So dealing with that plus personal thoughts, or making those extra thoughts personal and personalizing them, makes it more difficult. And movement is part of communication, and that's along with the epigesteretics. But even the lizards here, they do push-ups to communicate with each other. So communication is not just words. And when we're in map consciousness, we're in connection with that total movement of communication. And in a way, when we start to move towards the so-called psychosis end of things, it's a movement and it's a communication of some kind. And I wonder if it's also about needing help, or we need to help each other when we're in the map conscious state to stay in that state and not move out of it towards the structures of thought and society that would pathologize us. And meaning is a language. It's a living language. And life itself is the meaning of life. And I was thinking again how important it is to not be attached to any perceptions or insights. And that's part of my self-dialogue, is not just thinking of a couple good things, writing them in a book, and then clinging onto them like there's something special. Well, none of this is special. And one day I really hope to be able to face that real terrifying fear and just look at it and be with it. It's sort of like this internal death that happens, but somehow I haven't been able to move through it. And we, as people who go through map consciousness, we look like we have a disorder when the brain is deconditioning itself from the order of society's conditioning to the order of life itself. And I'm reading a book called On Our Own by Judy Chamberlain. And it was written in the 70s, and I can't believe it because it's so pertinent and relevant today. But she mentioned building up the confidence and self-esteem of all the people involved in the work. And we as people who go into map consciousness definitely have work to do to understand the states, and also for the world. We all connected with having a sense that we need to do something to help the world. And Krishnamurti says, I am the world and the world is me. And I feel personally like I connected with that feeling state in the state of so-called mania. And one feels completely responsible for the whole world. But then one gets sort of crushed by that because it's hard to do on one's own. So I hope that if I share this one day, that other context, whether it's one thing or 10 things or no things, or not even the things, but just the process itself, helps to just build a little bit of confidence or understanding. I don't know what it is. And she's so forward thinking. She said, even a person who struggles to successfully maintain his or her own way of thinking, like I've been doing here, can be damaged by this form of psychological assault. So even if somebody goes through the system and they don't think, oh, I'm defective and diseased, it's still damaging to be told that and to go through the experiences of indoctrination into believing that. And I wrote down that I saw a little tiny fly, and he actually had little wings on his head. And I don't know if they actually flapped, but he was sitting there with 2 little wings on his head, and he flies quite chaotically. But I've never seen a fly with like these extra wing appendages to help with their chaotic flight path. And he was cleaning his wings. It was really cute. And I started reading my writings from 6 years ago, before I was diagnosed with anything. And it was interesting because a lot of it's the same that I talk about now. It's like I knew certain things and had certain visions before I was ever diagnosed with anything. And then the diagnosis was like, no, that stuff didn't mean anything. Yet 6 years later, I'm getting in touch with that and saying the same things. So it's from that same place that one gets in touch with. And what happens when I speak nature and infinity and not thought and limitation? And one thing I wrote 6 years ago is that that language is alive and always there. So I had a sense of this other language, of this other communication, of being in touch with something else that speaks through me. And I feel like MAP and so-called psychosis is an attempt to destroy the old language, even though sometimes it destroys the person. But if one can just deny that kind of language and move towards the other, and I don't mean just, that sounds like an oversimplification, but part of it is purging this old language from the nervous system. And when that happens, we see how scary and detrimental it is. And it's important to see it and observe it and not get attached to it or run from it, just really be with it, which there's no real paradigm for supporting people through. What if more people spoke this language of nothingness? And it seems like all symptoms are seeing or hearing something beyond thought, or hearing something that's kind of off, to see the offness of it all. And I wrote this blurb here, and I'll just read it for the sake of hearing myself say it. Sound implies movement, like hearing something hit the ground. It was an orange falling out of a tree. One might look to find out, or just know from previous experience, thus not feel the need to look. That's what thought does. It's saying what we know from previous experience. Thus we think we don't have to look. We think we don't have to pay attention. This is partly adaptive. We learn so we don't have to put our energy of attention on something, like a humming noise of a fan. We eventually don't hear it at all. Because our thoughts go on constantly, and we mistake that for reality, we have turned our attention down on reality. Just like if we have a rope and whip it in a circle, it appears as a circle, but it is a line, a rope. Our circular thoughts make it seem like there is someone swinging the rope, thinking the thoughts. I think there could be a perception theory of supposed mental illness. Our perception is changing, kind of like how our eyesight can change over time and eventually we need glasses. Well, this change in perception is more radical and it actually increases our ability to perceive. But we generally don't think about acquiring such abilities partway through life. So what have you seen and what do you see? So I wonder, why do we no longer smell that the sound of thought is dangerous? The sounds of thought fade into the background, just like the smell that we no longer smell because it's determined not to be dangerous. Why does the computer brain make the sensitivity of the brain, the sensitivity to life, fade into the background? And I sit here in 98% nature and 2% human constructs. But why do most of us live in 98% human constructs? And then we wonder why we go crazy. And I remember in map consciousness feeling like I could steer the whole world with my gestures, my movements, my actions. And at some point this became scary because it was a huge responsibility and I felt like I no longer knew what I was doing. I think part of the trouble is in trying to do something when really we aren't the doer in that state at all. And I think that the sound of thought is partly the sluggishness. It's the energy drainer. In map consciousness, our brains work at the speed of light. And I wrote down that power over creates memes, words, and sounds for people to believe, whereas power with relieves people of the believer and puts people in contact with the perceiver. And I was thinking about how science wants to predict stuff, and even our ego wants to predict stuff. It wants to predict what to do. And in map consciousness, sometimes we can predict and prophesize things and see the future, because the mind is a scientific instrument in itself, and it's accessed the quantum state, but it makes the little predictions of science seem ridiculous in a way because the brain itself can see way beyond it. So that kind of game is over just by this new capacity of the brain. It's a different order of operation altogether. And in David Bohm's book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, he calls the new mode of language he is playing with the Rio mode, which is a flowing mode of language. And that resonates with me because I had a lot of language flowing out of me, and it's almost like in map consciousness one gets in touch with a flowing mode of language, not as trying to create one, but just as one is in that state. There is language and new perceptions flowing out of that person. So perhaps that kind of state naturally creates that flowing language versus trying to create a flowing language from a state of not being in the flow. And I feel like the way we use language now is Newtonian. And when science is discovering quantum physics, we need a language to match those discoveries to make that come into existence. Because the discovery of it didn't create that, it was already there. But in order for us to see that, we need to speak in a way that makes it possible. And David Bohm says a few things that are cool in his book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. He said nature will respond in accordance with the theory with which it is approached. And I feel like human nature will respond in accordance with the theory with which it's approached So if somebody's approached by somebody who's just thinking that they're going to put a mental illness label on somebody, then human nature will respond accordingly. So the way a vulnerable person is approached is very important. And can we approach nature as beauty with beauty? And I feel like the brain is shifting towards beauty. And the mind is unlimited, but the body is limited. And I'm wondering if this is part of the reason why I need to keep a lid on consciousness. And David Bohm said, theories as ways of looking, modes of perception, guides to perception. They're not separate substances. Even with self-dialogue, I'm sharing so many things that overlap, contradict, add, subtract, yet each one is a way of looking. And I wrote, I seem to be a way of looking that constantly changes, that creates a new insight. And can the brain guide perception to see beauty? Or can perception create beauty in the brain? And these are all different ways of looking at one reality. And that's part of the point of self-dialogue, is just to look at reality in different ways. Look at experience in different ways, not in terms of right, wrong, good, bad, better, worse. And I wrote, nature is made of a substance called beauty, but we're so busy looking for truth that we can't see it. And we've turned beauty into pleasure. So we're looking for pleasure instead of looking at beauty in the moment. And what happens when the mind moves faster than the speed of light? Then consciousness leaves the body, it travels. And Bohm also said, the undivided wholeness in flowing movement. To me, that sounds somewhat like map consciousness. Not just the words, but the actual felt sense of the truth of that. And he talks about the word formative, and I feel like human beings are formative, and we can form language and be formative in our communication. And human consciousness has a relative stability and autonomy, which is the body. And he defines formative cause as an ordered and structured inner movement that is essential to what things are. And I feel like map consciousness in a way is a formative cause. It causes new language, it causes insight, it causes reaching out, it causes responsibility, action, new gestures. And this energy, as it's doing that, is changing the DNA, it's changing the muscles, it's changing everything. And it's forming new meaning. It's getting the body to see new meaning. And not cling to those meanings, but see meaning moment to moment, new meaning moment to moment.